a question for you. Was the Revolutionary War a religious war? Some colonists dreamed of the Americas being a new Zion, a city on a hill. This concept of American exceptionalism and God's favor to this nation is as old as the Pilgrims. Okay, Ben Franklin wanted to put the parting of the Red Sea on our quarter. Why? To him, the United States represented the promised land. Okay, was this the universal opinion at the time? No, but it was a strong undercurrent nonetheless. Okay, England was corrupt. The colonists were on the side of right. All right, this is actually still how history is kind of taught. Actually, was the war explicitly religious though? No, of course not. Remember, in 1776, a mere 17% of the population were church members, okay? The Great Awakening's impact was significant on setting a tone for kind of American religious expression and experience, but it was not that impactful kind of regarding religious adherence, okay? However, once the revolution was won, the U.S. decided to do something that no one has ever done before, and that was not have a state church. Okay, there's lots of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into it here, but it was really something new. Okay, and this decision not to have a state church is going to allow for a plethora of new religions over time, often with women as founders and leaders. All right. So after the revolution, you get kind of this assumption of a Protestant nation. Jews and Catholics were tolerated mostly. Native religions weren't tolerated at all. But you get this kind of pan-Protestantism culture that emerges, but with a lot of room for kind of experimentation, as we will see. Okay, but first I want to talk a little bit about views of womanhood. All right, there's this huge shift in how women are viewed during the Revolutionary era. Okay, so if the concept of like a good wife defines Puritan views on womanhood, then the Republican mother defines this era. Okay, so wrapped into this is this like new idealized version of womanhood, and it's the idea that women need to be educated in order to raise good citizens. Okay, so we are seeing kind of a fusing of a need for religious and civic training in children, and that this task would fall onto mothers. Okay, so again, motherhood is wrapped into this. Okay, but now there's really a need for these women to be educated. Okay, now this concept is somewhat short-lived. Okay, and this will eventually give way to the concept of true womanhood. This term is used a lot, though technically it was a term created in the 1960s as a way to kind of describe past ideals of womanhood in, American culture, Western culture, okay? So kind of the idea is that the cult of true womanhood is from 1820 to 1860. It's somewhat artificial, but it is actually kind of a helpful framework when we talk about this, okay? And kind of these three views of womanhood in America. The critical differences between is, Puritans believed that women were more religious because of experiences. All right, and then you get kind of this intermediate revolutionary motherhood ideal. And then the 19th century views on women believe them to be inherently more pious, okay? Okay, so there you have it, kind of three views of womanhood in American culture. All right, the Puritan, the Republican mother, and then the pious, angel in the parlor kind of idea, okay? And I really want to point out that there are cultural assumptions with all of these. There are always women who are being left out of these ideals, okay? They're not describing a reality. They're describing kind of an idealized version that culture is putting forth. Okay, so let's table that conversation for a little bit, because I want to talk to you about some prophets that emerge in the Revolutionary era that are particularly interesting. Okay. First, I want to talk about Mother Ann Lee and the Shakers. Okay. The Shakers are the most successful and longest lasting of the communal religious experiments in American history. Okay. They were led by a woman who claimed to be the second coming of Christ, and they believed that the millennial dispensation had begun with their small society. Okay. So Mother Ann Lee is the founder. We don't know exactly when she was born. She was baptized June 1st, 1742 in Manchester, England. So she's probably born a couple days beforehand. Manchester was one of those like really industrialized cities in England. You know, the ones where like life expectancy was utterly abysmal and the workers were horrifically abused. Her father was a blacksmith, and then she went and married another blacksmith. As you know, in her early marriage, she had 4 children, none of which survived past early childhood. Okay. And at some point during this time, she becomes increasingly fearful of sex. Okay. And in 1770, she has a vision of Adam and Eve having sex. And from this vision, she came to believe that this act had actually caused the fall of humanity. All right. And the entrance of sin into the world. So following this vision, Jesus then comes to her and told her to preach this message to the world, which she did. Okay. Now, you can imagine her contemporaries and even historians have had a field day with these visions. Okay. You know, the wild kind of guesses and things about her mental state. It's actually utterly ridiculous. Okay, she is hardly the first woman after having horrific losses of her own children to kind of argue that people should be living a celibate life. Okay, she's actually not that much of an outlier. So Lee ends up, you know, gaining a small following, but considering her radical message, it's not surprising that her groups faced significant persecution in England, okay? So in 1774, she, her husband, and a few other Shakers decide to leave England and try their luck in the American colonies. During Lee's lifetime, the Shakers grew modestly, and again, they did face persecution from their neighbors. The movement was not highly organized during her lifetime, and there was definitely some fluidity in ideas and practices during this time. It was actually after Lee's death that the leadership engaged in what was called the Great Gathering, okay, where the Shakers moved on to communal farms and they supported themselves, all right? Kind of like communist collectives, to be really honest. It was there that the community completely dismantled kind of the traditional family structure. That's what's so interesting about this group, okay? So men and women lived in dormitories, okay, and they all practiced sort of this celibate existence, okay? There was tons and tons of rules about how men and women should act when they're by each other. You know, there rules to the point of like, if 2 people go, you know, meet at the stairs, there was a rule for who would go first, so there was not unnecessary talking and thus unnecessary like temptation between men and women. Okay, so it's very, very interesting. And then if there were children, you know, some couples brought children when they joined the community. Some people just dropped off their children at Shaker communes because they couldn't raise them on their own. And then children were raised separately so boys were raised by men, girls were raised by women. Okay. So a complete dismantling of kind of this traditional family structure. All right. Now, alas, celibacy for all members of a religious community inhibits growth and longevity for a movement. And the Shakers did gradually decline in number. So as of today, there are 3 Shakers left. They are living at Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village in Maine. But they really are a fascinating example of kind of this American utopian experiment led by, you know, a strong, charismatic woman. All right, last but not least, I want to talk about Jemima Wilkinson, later known as the Universal Public Friend, and I will explain that as I go. Okay, so Wilkinson was born in the American colonies in 1751. She was a 4th generation European American, okay? She was kind of part of the who's who of the colonial elite, all right? She had a cousin who signed the Declaration of Independence. She had another cousin who, you know, was a commander in the colonial navy, all right? Her father owned a large farm. They were quite wealthy, okay? It appears that her father was a Quaker and her mother was not. Wilkinson had 11 siblings, and her mother died when she was 12 or 13 years old. Wilkinson was undeniably influenced by her Quaker heritage. However, during the First Great Awakening, inspired by the great evangelist George Whitefield, she joined the New Lights Baptists, okay? And so therefore, she actually gets kicked out of the Society of Friends in 1776. Rough year, all right, for the colonists. Incidentally, her sister also gets kicked out of the Society of Friends for getting pregnant without being married, and her brothers were kicked out for joining the colonial army and fighting and wanting to fight against the British. Okay, so there's kind of this real crisis in their home with their faith. With all of this stress going on, Wilkinson becomes very ill. Okay, and she dies. All right, I'm not talking about a spiritual death. She, according to sources, she literally died. And in Wilkinson's place, the universal public friend kind of emerges, all right? So the idea is that Wilkinson died and the universal public figure, a messianic figure, takes over Wilkinson's body, okay? Now, the friend says that the friend's mission is to preach to a sinful and dying world. Okay, so kind of what's going on here, all right? So you have Wilkinson dies, you have the universal public friend, who's a messianic figure, take over Wilkinson's body, and the universal public friend describes themselves as having no gender at all, okay? And so this is something that kind of early followers and historians have long kind of dealt with or kind of had trouble with, really, is pronouns about the friend. But what's really interesting is people would just ask the friend, well, what should we call you? And the friend simply responded, I am what I am. And the friend just referred to the friend's self as the friend. Okay, so the friend goes out preaching around the colonies, okay, facing persecution. But the friend does gather, a group of followers. So kind of what is the theology? What is the ministry of the friend? It's been kind of described as an interesting blend of practical, familiar Bible teachings, obscure mysticism involving like dreams, prophecies, faith healings, though eventually the friend kind of steps away from faith healing. Though in general, you can see real ties between the friend's theology and Quakerism, okay? The theology is not terribly unique, to be really honest. This community truly forms around the charismatic figure of the friend, okay? The friend did say that celibacy was preferable, but the friend did not forbid sex or marriage, okay, as, like the Shakers did. The friend's closest companion was a woman named Sarah Richardson, who moved in with the friend and took the name Sarah Friend. We really don't know the exact nature of that relationship, but obviously they were very important people in each other's life. Okay, there was an attempt to build a town for believers that wasn't terribly successful. The friend dies in 1819. The movement lingers on for a little bit, but it falls apart because really it truly was the friend that sort of bound this group together. Okay, so a few things about the friend. Number one, this is a really interesting example of, a prophet emerging in this kind of unstable time in U.S. history. Obviously, the fact that the friend completely rejects gender pronouns also makes it a very relevant topic for today. In fact, the friend used to be kind of obscure history and now gets more attention than I have ever seen. There's, newspaper articles about the friend, and I put on Moodle interesting NPR podcast about the friend, and you can get it's 40 minutes, I can't remember. But there's a ton more information if you are interested in this historical figure and want to learn more. So yes. All right. I am going to wrap up this video because we're about at 15 minutes. But if you have any questions or anything, feel free to shoot me an email, let me know. All right. Thanks, everybody.